Well, Scripture is very clear that the tempter does also have a voice. That one that Scripture calls the accuser or Satan. He definitely speaks to us as well. And it's interesting just how subtle the voice of our enemy can be. I think oftentimes people expect that if they're going through some kind of temptation, that it's always going to be really loud and obnoxious and be this, this very conspicuous voice. But when you read the stories, for example, of when Jesus goes in the wilderness and he's tempted by the enemy, there's a lot that's going on there. I mean, of course, there are specific temptations. Satan tempts Jesus as he's been on a 40-day fast in the middle of the wilderness. He says, hey, why don't you take these rocks and turn them into bread? And of course, there's a temptation to basically to jump off the top of the temple, and why don't you do a great miracle and the angels will come down and rescue you? I mean, the temptations are in a sense conspicuous in one way. He says, why don't you bow down before me and I'll give you the kingdoms of the earth. But what I think is most significant about those three temptations in the wilderness, it's not just about devil worship. It's not just about, and in fact, some of the things the enemy tempts Jesus to do would not be bad things for him to do. What would be wrong with Jesus taking the rocks and turning them into bread? I mean, there's nothing on the surface about that would seem wrong. But I think the key to how we often are able to recognize when we're being tempted actually lands in the first part of that phrase. What Satan specifically says to Jesus is, if you are the Son of God, then why don't you do these things? And I have found that the voice of the enemy often comes in this way. If you are who you say you are, or if you are who God says that you are, why don't you prove it? Why don't you prove your value? Why don't you prove your worth? Almost every voice, not even just the voice of the enemy, most voices in our lives are always telling us that if we really are valuable, if we really have worth, then we need to do something to prove that. What was so beautiful about that story is that Jesus had just heard the voice of his Father really openly for the first time in his incarnate form, at least in terms of his ministry. There was that voice that came when John baptizes Jesus that said, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased." And the difference between, there are many differences between Jesus and us, but I think one of the big differences between Jesus and us is that Jesus always completely trusted the voice of his Father. His Father said, "You are my beloved Son," and Jesus believed that. So when the enemy comes and says, if you are who you say you are, or if you are who God says that you are, why don't you prove it to me? Why don't you prove it to somebody else? Jesus didn't feel the need to do that because he was fully assured in the voice of his Father. He was sure of his identity, knowing that he was a beloved Son. But I think that's the most subtle and most common way that the enemy still tries to tempt us. If you really have value, why don't you work harder? If you really have value, then you'll get a promotion. If you really are something special, if you really are something great, why don't you show me? And he tempts us then and tricks us into that cycle of performance and striving that the whole world is caught up in. And that's where I think we so desperately need to be well acquainted with the voice of God that says, you are my beloved son, you are my beloved daughter. You don't have to prove anything to anybody else. You don't have to prove yourself to somebody else who's alive. You don't have to prove yourself to somebody else who's long gone, whose expectations you're still trying to meet up to. You don't have to prove yourself to your company. You don't have to prove your worth to anybody. You can just be assured and confident in the fact that you are my beloved son and you're my beloved daughter, and allow everything about who you are now to be shaped out of the love of God instead of the sense that you have something that you need to prove. But I think that's the most direct way that Satan often attempts to speak to us. Don't mean to get preaching now. Sorry.